Republican senator from Ohio, close ally of Donald Trump, Senator J.D. Vance, Republican of Ohio. So I will get to the Middle East in a second, but he just put the Ukraine issue on the fore. And what is your response?
Well, first, Jake, the idea that Putin loves Donald Trump or Donald Trump loves Putin is absolutely absurd. Putin was actually pretty well behaved during the Trump administration. He invaded another country during the Biden administration. So for these guys to say that Putin prefers Donald Trump is completely ignores the underlying realities on the ground here. We actually had some real security deterrence when Donald Trump was president. And of course, it's not just in Ukraine. So again, what Fetterman's saying is preposterous. Reality shows Putin didn't like when Donald Trump was president and was a lot better behaved. And I think to accuse Donald Trump of being pro-Putin completely ignores the reality on the ground.
Well, what Fetterman might say were he here is that Putin was getting a lot of things that he wanted out of Donald Trump, so he didn't need to be as hostile. Donald Trump was clearly more friendly to him than other presidents have been, one way or the other, but also Donald Trump was more hostile to NATO.
I don't think that's right, Jake. What I think Donald Trump did is he engaged in strategic deterrence. You have to negotiate sometimes even with bad people, even with your enemies, but you have to deter those people. And if you engage in smart deterrence like Donald Trump did, he doesn't invade countries like Ukraine. So I don't buy that argument, but I understand why Democrats repeat that talking point.
Well, let me ask you about Ukraine.
Sure.
Because you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that you don't think it makes sense, the Biden pitch for aid to Ukraine. You've been accused of appeasement. You've been accused of surrender. Even the National Review had a column about that. And again, I'm going to get to Iran and Israel, which I know is a big pressing story. But I do want you to address that because the National Review is basically saying that your solution to the problem of Russia invading a sovereign nation, Ukraine, is to just surrender. Are they wrong?
No, look, my solution to the problem is to rebuild our own country. The reason that we're in this position, Jake, is because we're stretched way too thin. We're stretched way too thin. And the number of weapon systems that we need, that Ukraine needs, that Taiwan needs, that Israel needs, and we can't do all of these things at once. So when you're stretched too thin, you've got to focus and you've got to rebuild your own country. Let's take just one of those weapon systems that we're talking about, 155 millimeter artillery shells. The Russians currently have a 5-1 advantage over the Ukrainians. The Israelis will need this stuff. The Taiwanese need this stuff. And of course, America needs this stuff. Can we possibly fight all of those conflicts at once? No, the math just doesn't make sense. So what we should be doing is with Ukraine, encouraging them to take a defensive posture, not these disastrous counteroffensive the Biden administration has been promoting.
The counteroffensive is within Ukraine, though. The counteroffensive is within Ukraine. They're not seeking land from Russia. And in fact, just today...
I'm not passing judgment on the morality of what they're doing. Of course, it's their territory, Jake, but you have to acknowledge military reality on the ground. If they're going to waste a ton of money, a ton of lives, and a ton of ammunition on a counteroffensive strategy, but a defensive strategy might actually work, we've got to choose the strategy that might actually work.
But the counteroffensive is within Ukrainian territory. Just today, Zelensky was suggesting that the strike by Iran on Israel should serve as a wake-up call in terms of this greater battle, and maybe you disagree with people who see it this way, between autocracies and democracies, Israel being a democracy, as is Ukraine, Iran and Russia being autocracies. What do you say to that?
Well, I think foreign policy is not a nursery rhyme, and it should serve as a wake-up call, but it should serve as a wake-up call that we have to rebuild our own industrial base. Let's take another weapon system that's really important. The Patriot Interceptor system almost definitely saved a lot of Israeli lives last night. The Ukrainians want thousands of those per year. Do you know how many we manufacture in a year, Jake? 550. We cannot possibly, I've repeated this for years now, we cannot possibly support Ukraine and Israel and our own defense needs in the way that these guys demand. So I think we should focus. I think Israel's a much closer ally, is a much more core American national security interest. And of course, we've got to focus on ourselves. That means encouraging the Ukrainians to take a defensive strategy. This is really important, Jake, because you're going to hear a lot of calls across Washington, D.C. that we now have to pass this supplemental.
Right.
But if we pass the Ukraine and Israel supplemental and send a ton of weapons to Ukraine that the Israelis need, we're actually weakening Israel in the name of helping them. It doesn't make any sense. It ignores mathematical reality.
The supplemental, which your leader, Senator McConnell, has called on the House to pass, the supplemental contains money for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan. So it's not a question of either or. It's a question of both.
I think it is a question of either or, Jake, because it's not about the money again, it's about the weapons. If we pass the supplemental, we go from making 550 Patriot interceptors to 650. That's 100 more, and the world needs thousands of these things. So really, it goes back to the basic math of this. If you don't make enough weapons to fight 3 wars, you've got to figure out how to focus. And my proposal is we focus on ourselves and we focus on our closest allies.
So let's talk about that. What do you think Israel should do? What do you think the U.S. should do in response to Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, we condemn the Iranian attack. It's great to actually see bipartisan leadership from across the aisle saying that. We certainly stand with our friends in Israel. I'm not going to pretend to counsel Israel on their strategic response to this. I think the most important thing for the United States here is to, one, prevent this from becoming a broader regional conflict because we're already stretched very thin, and 2, to support our Israeli allies. I'm sure they're talking to the Iranians through back channels. I'm sure they know a lot more than a senator in Washington, D.C., and I think we should defer to their strategic wisdom because it's their country, and they should call the shots.
What about those who fear that Israel escalating, and again, I'm not expressing my opinion on this, but what about those who fear that Israel escalating risks a greater war? I mean, and we've heard Senator Coons was on the show earlier saying everyone needs to take a breath. And then you heard John Bolton on the show saying that this is an example of what deterrence has got us and there needs to be a much more muscular response.
Well, look, I certainly think there is a real fear of escalation. Senator Coons is right about that. Part of the reason why we have a fear of escalation, Jake, is because our deterrence is so weak. And why is it so weak? Because the world sees a United States that's stretched so thin. I think if we want to reestablish deterrence, the most important thing is not how we or Israel respond to this attack. It's how we focus on the long term on rebuilding our country. People aren't worried that we're not thumping our chest enough. I know that's the John Bolton response to this. People think that the United States is a paper tiger right now. We've got to rebuild our manufacturing capacity. We've got to rebuild our capacity to support our own troops and our allies with weapons system. That is what will reestablish deterrence. And that's unfortunately why I think this supplemental actually spreads us even further and even thinner instead of focusing. Focus is what's going to create deterrence.
So you would agree with what Senator Rubio said earlier in the show, that the Senate should just pick up the aid bill for Israel, just discreetly for Israel, that the House passed?
What's important, Jake, to remember, what Senator Rubio said, as I understand it, is exactly right. The Senate could pass an Israel supplemental tomorrow in the United States Senate. The House has taken it up already. The Senate's already taken up a couple different versions that Senate Democrats have blocked. So we could get this out of the U.S. Congress tomorrow if Democrats didn't block it. And again, we've got to focus on our core problems. I think Israel is much more important to the United States than Ukraine is.
All right, Senator J.D. Vance, Republican of Ohio. Please come back again soon.